What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Monday, June 26, 2017, getting on to the end of the month. We're just a hair over a week away from Independence Day. We're going to be talking about that as we get into the beginning of next week here. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And unfortunately, we have to start today's broadcast with a very sad announcement, which is that Joyce Riley, host of the Power Hour, fellow traveler on the road to truth and freedom, passed away yesterday following a very long fight with cancer. And in the last couple of months, she'd been in and out of hospices, and people kept thinking maybe she'll pull back, maybe she'll pull back. And she kept broadcasting right up virtually to the end. And everybody in the independent media knows her. I was on her show, I don't even remember how many times. And so it is a little bit sad to see such an icon of the independent media pass away like that. So we're all thinking about Joyce and her family in these very, very difficult times. Okay, now the United States Supreme Court is nearing the end of the current term, and so we're starting to see a whole bunch of Supreme Court decisions coming on down. Perhaps the one that has got the most people upset is the Supreme Court upheld Donald Trump's travel ban, and they really didn't have much choice because it is written into Title VIII that the president can, by proclamation, ban certain groups of individuals coming to this country. And, of course, the open borders people out there saying, we'll sue, we'll sue. It's already gone to the Supreme Court. That's basically it. Now, another decision that came on down, I'm not so sure I agree with it, but basically this goes to this Trinity Church, which had applied for taxpayer assistance in dealing with some of their issues, and the state had refused, citing the separation between church and state. And the Supreme Court said, no, states cannot refuse financial aid to churches. And that does, unfortunately, open up that question of just how much separation there is between the church and state. This was a debate that was ignited not too long ago with George Bush's faith-based agenda, where they were using the churches as instruments of U.S. government policy, which is, in theory, not what they're supposed to be here. And, of course, last week they came on out, and this bears repeating, there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. The First Amendment is an absolute, and this attempt to get around the First Amendment by saying this is hate speech or that is hate speech will not fly. You can say whatever you want. Hopefully you'll have the responsibility to be saying things that are true. And obviously courtesy and respect should be part of the American discourse. But you have a right to come on out and express your opinion about things that are going on without the risk of having somebody come on in and say, oh, that's hate speech. We need to shut you up. You know, the humans aren't warming the world. And the carbon Nazis say, oh, that's hate speech. You're just a hater. Shut it all down. And, of course, we know what nation likes to use that hammer on free speech around the world. And, unfortunately, they have succeeded in many countries where you are not allowed to criticize the actions of the government of Israel without it being declared hate speech and silenced. And they were trying to bring that to the United States of America, and the Supreme Court just shot that down. The First Amendment right to freedom of speech is an absolute. So when we go on out there and tell you the truth about what's going on with all these corrupt politicians or how the CIA is running drugs to the American people, we are protected by that First Amendment, and it is a victory for the truth movement, for the peace movement. Now, there's another case that is been added to the docket of the Supreme Court. We're probably not going to hear a decision this term. It'll go into the next term. The Department of Justice is petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court to basically say that U.S. search warrants extend to data stored on foreign servers. Now, the current law, and this is based on international law, the U.S. government is allowed to serve warrants on things inside the United States of America, and the Justice Department wants to have the Supreme Court say, yes, U.S. warrants are valid in other countries on other people's servers, which I don't think actually compels those foreign governments to go along with it, especially given the recent history of U.S. spying gratuitously on people, stealing business secrets and so forth. So that one's going to go up before the Supreme Court next term. Now, unfortunately, the Trump administration has made a slight modification to the rules of engagement regarding drone strikes, because the previous engagement had a provision in there saying that there had to be a near certainty of no civilian casualties before the drone trigger could be pulled. Unfortunately, that has now been taken out, which basically means that there are going to be more civilian casualties from these drone strikes into countries that we're not technically at war with. All right, we're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Now, Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, has come out with a bombshell report, and you need to pay attention to this one. Apparently, before Donald Trump launched that Tomahawk cruise missile attack onto that Syrian air base, U.S. intelligence agencies said there was no evidence that Syria had used a gas attack on this town of Idlib. There was no support for it whatsoever, and Trump just ignored them and launched the cruise missile attack, which turned out to be an embarrassment when most of the cruise missiles actually missed the target. But this is a very alarming story, that even though there was no evidence of this attack on Idlib, even though the U.S. intelligence agencies, who are supposed to provide accurate information to the president for him to act on, said there was no evidence to support this, and Trump just went ahead and did it anyway. This is a very alarming development for a president who campaigned last year on the idea of pulling back from some of these foreign entanglements. Now, apparently, now that they're locked into Al-Tamf, the U.S. forces are locked into Al-Tamf because Syria pushed through to the Iraq border. They don't have a corridor to move northward on. And the U.S. military concedes they've lost the race to occupy southeast Syria. At the moment, they're just sitting there, holding on to the territory. And apparently, at some point, they're either going to be joined in another battle, or they're going to be airlifted out of there. Now, as you know, this is the beginning of Ramadan. And Syria, to celebrate, has gone ahead and released hundreds of prisoners of the U.S.-backed so-called moderate rebels. They just issued a blanket release and said, go forth, have a good Ramadan, and we hopefully will never see you again, which I think probably is going to be the result here. Meanwhile, there's been another incident down in the south near Quneitra, where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and allied groups from the so-called Free Syria Army launched a large-scale advance against the Syrian Arab Army in the province of Quneitra. Now remember, these are both rebel groups. They're fighting each other now over control of the countryside. And apparently the Israeli Air Force conducted airstrikes on government positions in the province, claiming some projectiles landed in the Israel-occupied part of the Golan Heights, which technically is still part of Syria. And as usual, the shells hit dirt, no damage, no injuries, no deaths, but we'll just send the warplanes in there, targeting artillery pieces and 2 main battle tanks. This is, by the way, the second incident in 2 days where Israel's gone on in and just hauled off and attacked Syrian forces. And Syria is now issuing a warning to Israel of dangerous repercussions for aggressive actions. And again, the Golan Heights, although occupied by Israel, is still legally part of Syria. And Israel does not actually have any kind of a right to respond to artillery shells hitting empty dirt lots in the Golan. But it looks like while Syria is still weak, dealing with the U.S.-backed rebels, dealing with ISIS, that Israel may be about to make a move on the Golan to simply conquer it and say it's now ours. They've been talking about this for weeks. And my guess is it may well happen next week on the 4th of July holiday when Americans are not watching the TV news and they're out there with the hot dogs and whatever it is that they do on the 4th of July. Some places still very fortunate they're allowed to have fireworks, not here anymore, unfortunately. And by the way, a little program note. RBN will be broadcasting live on the 4th of July, Independence Day. At least that's what I'm being told now. It could change, but as of right now, the plan is we will be live. Now, a lot of dynamics going on in Saudi Arabia ever since Mohammed bin Salman took over as crown prince, which effectively puts him in charge of the country. Because his father, King Salman, is 81. He's not really all there, kind of like Nancy Pelosi. And so Mohammed bin Salman is actually functioning as the ruler of Saudi Arabia. Now, last week there was a story that the United States and Israel had been behind the scenes orchestrating this change in the crown prince. And apparently another Saudi prince, Khalid bin Farhan al Saud, who lives in Germany, says that the deal that came on down was Mohammed bin Salman has promised absolute obedience to the U.S. and Israel and doing whatever they ask him to do, which includes working to settle all the current residents of Gaza in the northern part of the Sinai. So that's the dynamics behind that. And now that you have that little bit of a backstory, all of a sudden we have Saudi Arabia saying they're not going to go soft on Putin anymore, and they're vowing to destroy the Russian forces in Syria in 3 days. With all those brand new weapons Donald Trump just sold them, which hopefully are going to work as advertised. But we're looking at a regional war. We're on the verge of a regional war. It's just, this rush to a global war. It's insane. It's terrifying to watch. So, and an even more alarming story. This is coming out of 12160. Apparently, Kiev has announced that U.S. combat troops are deploying in Donbass. There are now U.S. boots on the ground in the eastern part of Ukraine. It's just another provocation toward Russia, along with the escalation in Syria. This idea of having a war with Russia, it's absurd. It is absolutely, absolutely absurd. And apparently Moscow is upset because there was a U.S. Marines deployment in Norway, ostensibly for training exercises with the Norwegians, and the U.S. government, to nobody's surprise, has now decided they're going to extend that deployment for at least a year, possibly longer. And if you're my age, you remember this is how we got into Vietnam. Oh, we're sending advisors and trainers, and they won't actually be fighting anything. And, of course, 60,000 Americans dead later was the result of that one here. Now, according to secret documents obtained by a Russian intelligence service, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO mounted a campaign to try and prevent the Russian republics from merging. They wanted to break Russia into lots of little tiny parts that were going to be easy to bully, easy to push around. It didn't work, but that's the way NATO was thinking at the time. Another story, this is coming out of Zero Hedge. Apparently, in the last few days of his office, Obama ordered cyber weapons to be implanted into Russia's infrastructure. These are supposedly sleeper cyber weapons that can be activated on a single signal. Now, the official story is this was done in response to Russia's interference in our election, blah, 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 blah. But it looks like they're already out there trying to penetrate Russia's infrastructure in the eventuality that we actually go to war. So, and all this, of course, is very, very secret. You know, it's really interesting. Trump, about a week ago, asked a very cogent question. If Obama knew that Russia was interfering with the election, why didn't he do anything? And the excuses in response to that question are all over the place, including that Obama was doing all this stuff, but he had to keep it secret, that Obama didn't want to appear partisan by engaging with the Russians, and all of it's just, it's thin air. And it's amazing that they actually seem to think that most Americans are still believing any of this stuff. Even though the polls are now showing the American people are sick and tired of this Russia narrative. They're not buying it. They want it to go away. They're sick of hearing about it here. Now, apparently the United States is sending signals that they may choose to withdraw from, meaning violate, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is one of the many nuclear forces treaties. This one governs medium-range missiles, which are something that you would use on a battlefield rather than the big ICBM, let's hurl these at each other's countries. But apparently there's serious talk about how the U.S. may just pull on out of this and start building more of those. Russia is saying they will take retaliatory measures in response to the U.S. pulling out of the treaty. In other words, a new nuclear arms race. Now, a lot of this is coming from various bureaucracies and advisors, and there is obviously a schism inside the White House regarding Russia, and it's revealed by this story that came out of Newsmax. Trump eager for big meeting with Putin, some advisors wary. And reading between the lines here, it looks like Trump wants to meet with Putin to try and sort out some of this insanity, but then apparently many of the current administration officials are saying, don't talk to him, don't talk to him, maintain your distance, you don't want to get next to him, he's got cooties, or whatever the excuse is. They're trying to keep their little Russia agenda going. Now, over in North Korea, they're trying to calm things down. South Korea is starting to make overtures to North Korea. The U.S. actually took the position South Korea did not have a right to talk to North Korea without the U.S. government's permission, and South Korea said, no, we don't need your permission. Well, we'll coordinate with you, we'll share information with you, but no, we don't need your permission to talk to a neighboring country. That would be like Germany coming on in and saying that we're not allowed to talk to Canada, to show you how absurd this is. And North Korea is saying the one area that is beyond the negotiation are the nuclear weapons. Because North Korea, which has already been the victim of one extraordinarily prolonged war, which they suffered greatly at the hands of South Korea and the United States, they want a deterrent, and that's the reason for having nuclear weapons, to deter other countries from invading you. That's really what it's all about. That was certainly the justification for all the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons built by the United States of America. Oh, we would never use these in a first strike. We have to have these to prevent other countries from striking us. And again, in all of history, there's only one country that's ever actually used nuclear weapons against another country, and that is the United States. If we want to curtail the nuclear threat, if we want a nuclear-free world, we ought to start with the one country that's actually done it. Meanwhile, Japan is ramping up the propaganda there. They've put together a new video urging citizens to seek shelter or just lie flat on the ground if North Korea launches a nuke at them. And I took a look at it. It seems to be about as useful as Bert the Turtle and Duck and Cover, which was all about reassuring the people they can survive a nuclear attack, even though they probably will not. All right, we're coming up here on a commercial break, and again, the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and we'll be back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Now, down in Israel, there's been another incident where olive trees belonging to the Palestinians have been destroyed by Israeli settlers. And, of course, the issue with an olive tree is that it takes 10 years from when you plant an olive tree to when you can get a saleable crop. And so every time they go on out and kill another grove of olive trees, it's an economic attack. And apparently on this one, somebody spray painted the Hebrew word for revenge on a stone. Revenge for what? Israel's taking their country. I mean, it really is ridiculous. Meanwhile, senior Israeli Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu believes the Israeli army should stop arresting Palestinians and execute them instead. It must execute them and leave no one alive, Eliyahu wrote in a Facebook post Tuesday. So, somebody remind me again, which is the religion of hate and violence? Because I'm getting awfully confused on this one. Now, over in Iran, Hassan Rouhani is condemning the siege of Qatar and basically saying it could easily destabilize the region, that Iran, the alliance between Qatar and Iran would actually benefit the region as well. And it has thrown the whole place into turmoil, which is leading to this article over in Journal Neo saying, has Washington lost the Middle East after Qatar? Meaning, have they lost control of the situation? And I would say that looking at what's going on over there, I think that's true. They're not in control anymore. They've kicked off all of these conflicts, all of this hostility between all these various groups. I mean, over in Syria, the U.S.-backed rebels are fighting each other now. And this was all about control of the oil and gas in the Middle East and what currency it was going to be sold for. And remember, back in, I think it was 2005, General Wesley Clark blew the whistle on this whole program, saying that there was a list of countries the United States was going to invade and regime change, ending with Iran in 2008, a little off the timeline, obviously, with the specific goal of making sure that those oil and gas resources were only sold for U.S. dollars to prop up what's left of our economy. Because we don't have anything else. Don't have any manufacturing. Nobody wants our GMO. The only thing they've got left is forcing the rest of the world to use the U.S. dollar, generously loaned at interest by the Federal Reserve, or alternatively, these other countries can bring us manufactured goods and agricultural produce in exchange for these boxes of paper with colored ink all over them or the numbers in the computer. Now, turning over to Yemen, Saudi Arabia has conducted over 50 air raids on Yemen in just 24 hours. They're not delaying putting those new U.S. weapons to use and just bombing the heck out of the whole place. And they're pushing back because the Yemeni forces have been taking out Saudi-backed troops, weapons facilities, and vehicles. So the whole place, it's a war zone. There's no other way to call it right now. And the worst problem they're dealing with right now is this cholera outbreak. The United Nations has declared Yemen is dealing with the worst cholera outbreak ever. And they're talking about 200,000 cases. 1,300 people have died, a quarter of them children. And the big question here is this just a natural outbreak, the result of malnutrition and no hygiene supplies, or was this a biological attack? Because cholera has been used as a weapon of war in the past. We know how devastating it can be. Remember, following the Haiti earthquake, and the UN troops went on in there, and apparently one of them had cholera, and it just went all over the island, just wiped out a significant portion of the population. Is that what they're trying to do here? Now, the United States is getting ready to extend the war into the cosmos. More about this when we come back.
Yes, you're on the air.
Oh, okay, thanks. All right. Sorry about that. I got a little away from the clock here. So we're talking about how the U.S. is getting ready to push the front of war out into the universe. And so there's this article that came out of Sputnik News, U.S. preps for limitless war with proposed new space corps. And they're basically pitching it as a whole new military branch. So we'll have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines, and the Space Corps. Now, the command structure has actually been in place for quite a while. It's called the Space Command. And up until recently, it's been mostly about taking care of surveillance satellites and things like that. So, now the problem I have with war in low Earth orbit is if we start blowing up each other's satellites, we're going to create a cloud of orbiting debris, which is going to make near-Earth orbit almost unusable to anybody. NORAD tracks things in orbit, and there's a lot of stuff up there. But they can't detect items below a certain size. And there have been incidents of debris causing damage to other satellites. There's at least one known case of two satellites actually colliding. So when you have an air battle and one plane shoots down another, everything blows up, then it comes on down to the ground, and that's the end of it. It's a completely different story in orbit, where you're going to have the debris. Some of it will go down, some of it will go up. The rest of it just goes into different orbits, and there's no way to track it. And so this is an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing for them to be doing up there. But if you look through history, you'll see that once a government gets into that state of mind of war, it's all about winning right now, and we don't care what happens 10, 15 years down the road. It's not our problem to deal with. Hence the use of depleted uranium munitions, which are not only harming the people living in the countries it's used on, it's harming our veterans who had to handle it. But again, victory or death, or blah, 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 blah. Now, as you know, one of the big stinks for the United States government was the torture that was uncovered at places like Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and these people should have been held to account for what were obvious violations of international law, and they weren't. And as a result, there is a new torture scandal. And apparently, hundreds of men swept up in the hunt for al-Qaeda militants have disappeared into a secret network of prisons in southern Yemen, where abuse is routine and torture extreme, including something called the grill, where they literally tie this victim to a grill over a source of heat to basically slowly broil them, the way Jacques de Molay was done. So the U.S. government is still out here committing these war crimes. And then they claim that the rest of the world hates us for our freedoms, which is absurd. Now again, while I am opposed to the wars, I do feel that we owe a debt to our soldiers. And it turns out over in Los Angeles, there's a huge problem with homeless veterans. Veterans who are coming on back, they can't find jobs. The VA isn't taking care of them. And apparently the number of homeless veterans in Los Angeles jumped by 23% just this last year alone. Now that is shameful. That is absolutely shameful. And I'll tell you what's even more shameful. The veterans who are coming home, the government for a while, they've dropped this thankfully, but the government wanted to declare all returning veterans by default suffering from PTSD and therefore unable to avail themselves of their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Bring them home, disarm them, dump them in the street. That's how they're treating those people who go on out and wage war to make the bankers richer than they are right now. Now, turning to the domestic politics here, as you know, there's been a huge amount of attention on this dodgy dossier 2, if you will, that supposedly claimed Donald Trump and a couple of prostitutes were behaving very badly in a hotel in Moscow. And apparently the individual behind it, the company behind it, are trying to basically stay out of the public light, and they're stalling investigators. The Senate Judiciary Committee wanted to have this company come on in, Fusion GPS, because it's refusing to answer questions and provide records. Who was actually paying for all this stuff? At one point, we know the FBI was. But the dossier is just absolute fiction and fairy tale, and we need to find out who was the motivating force behind all of this. And here's where it gets interesting. we've established that this Russia dossier was faked by this pro-Clinton firm. And yet, with the exception of Fox News and the New York Post, the corporate media will not cover it. Which is, I guess, why the corporate media is going out of business right now. Now, Donald Trump, in an interview on Fox and Friends on Friday, basically referred to this whole Mueller investigation as ridiculous. And it is. They've got nothing there. It's just an excuse to churn out smear jobs against the president in the complicit corporate media, on and on and on and on, to try and sell the public that even though we don't have any proof, we're sure there's something out there. Now, the Russia narrative is collapsing. Polls are showing the majority of Americans are not buying into this. Polls are showing the majority of Americans just don't want to hear this anymore. They're sick and tired of it. Enough is enough. And here's where it gets really kind of weird, because with all this talk about, is Donald Trump really under investigation? Are they investigating? And now we have Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Loretta Lynch are all under FBI investigation right now, the same week. And you're not seeing much of that on the corporate media either. Now, Judge Napolitano was the exception, because he basically came on out and said that if emails surface between Loretta Lynch and former DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz about furthering the Democratic interest surface, that's a felony offense. It's misconduct in office. So they're out there digging for that right now. Now, the good news is Representative Steve Scalise, his condition continues to improve. He's been upgraded from critical to fair condition. And the doctors are saying he's making good progress. And that really is a good thing. And everybody's pointing fingers, oh, it was this, it was that. Look at all the hateful rhetoric that we have seen in the corporate media this year. We even had Loretta Lynch was out there calling for blood in the streets. Well, Loretta, you got it. Maybe not in the streets, on a baseball diamond. And it has been absolutely shameful to see all these liberal icons, if you will, who are out there saying this was a good thing, they hoped this guy would die. They really seem to have lost touch with the real world. They're just caught up in their group think, their magic think, their fantasy that Hillary actually won and the world is a wonderful place. And much of the corporate media is going along with it. And the narrative is falling apart, and they're running the risk of literally triggering a civil war in the streets of America between the snowflake crybaby liberals and the rest of us. Washington Post is out there with all these stories. They're back to fanning racial tension. That's not what news reporting is supposed to be. News reporting is you give people the facts and they make up what it means. They decide what it means. Today's corporate media is, we're going to tell you what to think and forget about the facts. You don't need that. Now, CNN has had another embarrassment. Apparently, they ran a news item, again, about alleged ties between an ally of Donald Trump and the Kremlin. And as it turned out, they hadn't even fact-checked the story. And it fell apart, and they had to basically pull it from their website. They have not issued an official retraction. But apparently CNN's executive board is now saying there have to be new rules on the stories involving Russia. You have to go back to basic journalism 101. Check your facts, multiple sources, make sure that what you're putting out there is the truth. Now, in the old days of media, you had newspapers and magazines, which once they were on the newsstand, that was it. You can't take it back. One of the advantages of the Internet age is if corporate media puts out a story that's completely bogus, they can erase it from the website and act like it was never there to begin with. Now, over at NBC, Megyn Kelly's ratings are a disaster. This whole idea of luring her away from Fox and giving her a show where she's going to talk to interesting people. It's been an epic fail from the beginning. She wasn't able to goad Putin into saying anything that could be held against him. The episode with Alex Jones didn't make Alex Jones look all that good, but it did kick up a huge opposition that it appeared NBC and Megyn Kelly were legitimizing the independent media. And that is absolutely something. They're still trying to portray the independent media as just a bunch of guys, you know, in their spare bedroom, you know, with a bunch of cameras and computers. And yeah, that's where we are. And one of the things that really annoys me about all these paid liars who are still out there for the corporate media is how much money they are making to lie to you, while the independent media is just struggling just to get by. It really is insulting. Now, apparently, Stephen Colbert, following his little argument with Oliver Stone that CBS edited out, apparently he was on the talk show Evening Urgent, which is actually a Russian TV show. Apparently, he downed a couple of vodkas on the air and then announced he will be running for president in 2020. Yeah. Boy, wouldn't that be something? I remember when Reagan ran. And, of course, he'd already been governor of California. He'd been involved in politics for a long time. But the Democrats were just out there saying, an actor is president? I mean, you know, where are we going with this? And, yes, Reagan was an actor, and he was a good communicator. And he kind of got railroaded by George Herbert Walker Bush. And then, of course, he had his own deterioration issues later on in his administration. But this idea that we have movie stars want to run for president, Clooney wants to run for president, Cher wants to run for president, it really is absurd. And it does tell you just how disjointed and dysfunctional the U.S. government has become. All right, let's talk about the economy. Apparently, Italy is going to have to prop up two failing banks, or wind them up actually, for a cost of 17 billion euros. And this follows an emergency cabinet meeting yesterday, and basically they're going to split Veneto Banca and Banca Popolare di Vincenzi into good and bad banks, keeping some of the branches open. The good assets are being acquired by Italy's biggest retail bank, Intesa San Paolo, and the Italian government is basically going to bail out the bad assets. And I wish Italy had paid attention to what was going on over here following the 2008 meltdown of the mortgage-backed securities, because propping up the banks and using taxpayer funds to write off the bad debts didn't really fix the economy. In fact, it made things a lot worse for the ordinary American people. Now, here is a very alarming story. This is out of Blacklisted News. And I saw it in a couple of different places. Blacklisted is quoting from Forbes, and their writer, Brian Rich, basically pointing the finger at how the central banks have been buying up stocks like crazy to keep that stock market looking like it's still functioning. And it's, according to Brian Rich, it's gone too far. There's no way to pull back from it. It's beyond the point of recovery. And I understand how that works, because all of these banks, institutions involved in the plunge protection team, they're now holding vast blocks of stocks which are way overvalued, more overvalued than back in 1929. And the instant anybody starts to sell any of the stocks, the price will drop, and these banks could wind up instantly insolvent overnight, worse than AIG, worse than Lehman. Even the Bank of International Settlements is now in there saying that the next global financial crisis will hit with a vengeance. And they're absolutely right. You cannot run a national or global economy on debt. It simply will not work. Because by design of the central banks, the debt grows faster than the available money supply until the debt brings it down, and that's exactly where we are right now. Now, it's interesting. Earlier on Fox News, I was watching this TV commercial for one of these companies that are urging you to buy gold, buy gold, buy gold, and it really is always a good idea. But the commercial was talking about how gold is going up, and they had all these quotes from the financial press. Gold is headed up. Now's the time to buy in. And apparently gold suffered a flash crash. Somebody dumped $2 billion of paper contracts on the market. And again, they use those paper contracts to keep the price of gold, for that matter silver, down. They don't want you liquidating your stock portfolio. They don't want you closing those savings accounts. And for those banks who played fast and loose with other people's gold, they're trying to buy back gold, and they obviously want a bargain basement price on that. So it's all rigging and all manipulation. It's hard to imagine there's still any honest component left anywhere in our economic banking system. It's all scams all the time. And that is so incredibly dangerous. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're going to go take a telephone call from Glenn in Philadelphia. Aloha, Glenn. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today? Glenn, are you there? Yeah, now I can hear you.
I am here. Okay, very good. Yeah, it was a big crashing noise when they hit the button there. You know, Mike, I think you may have stumbled upon the next major privatized space business.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're going to find Dyson spheres out in space, but they could end up finding some sort of maybe a Dyson low Earth orbit debris vacuum up there at some point. You know, big contract thing. They go up, collect money from all the different nations, and go in there and go up, suck up those missing spacesuit gloves and broken satellite parts and stuff like that. They kind of float around and just kind of vacuum things up.
Well, actually, Japan put up an experimental satellite to try and deorbit debris through magnetic induction. Unfortunately, it really didn't work. I had proposed a system to be deployed from right here in Hawaii, since we're so close to the equator, that would simply launch a rocket vertically, not into orbit, but into the path of an oncoming piece of space debris, and just pop out a little cloud of carbon dioxide or something that the debris would slam into and slow it down enough to bring it out of orbit. But you're absolutely right. At some point, especially if they go to this insanity of a war in low Earth orbit, at some point after that, somebody's going to have a new vehicle, like a new updated space shuttle, that's basically a garbage truck in low Earth orbit. And they're just going to have to do that because there are so many businesses that, and the military, who are dependent on access to low Earth orbit.
Right. Well, I guess they have anti-satellite missiles at this point, but I don't think they're like used on a regular basis because it's all about the debris clouds. In the one James Bond movie, Die Another Day, they tried to blow up the satellite with a big reflector that was shining down the, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and you had the rocket, the missile blown up, and you know, just even there, you think like all this debris. If anybody starts blowing anything up, that'll just create a cloud of debris. Each piece of which is like a bullet that could tear through a space station or the shuttle or its rocket or something.
There was one incident where one of the windshields on the shuttle had this almost an inch-wide crater blasted into it, and when they finally figured out what it was, it turned out to be a paint fleck off of another vehicle. I mean, that is how insane these velocities are. They're not up there in the same orbit traveling together in formation. The orbits are inclined because most of the space-based nations are north or south of the equator, and that's why you get these orbital inclinations. And where they cross, that closing velocity is just absolutely insane.
Yeah, exactly. It's just crazy stuff. So, but well, you know, if they're not inclined to clean up the Texas-sized island of plastic debris floating in the Pacific Ocean, they're probably not going to be going after that too much either.
Well,
clean up after ourselves
again, the island of plastic garbage in the Pacific isn't at this point causing significant economic harm. The loss of low Earth orbit, that would be a disastrous setback for our technology.
Right.
Anyway, Glenn, we got to take a break for station identification.
Take care.
We'll be right back.